Welcome to 28storms.com. This is an early morning tropical weather update on this Thursday, August 18th. There are two main features in the Atlantic Basin today, one being 93L Invest located to the south of Jamaica. The Hurricane Center has now increased the probability of development within 48 hours to 70%, so interests in Honduras and the lower half of Belize really need to pay attention to that system. We do not expect rapid intensification, but this could easily become our next tropical depression or even named storm of the 2011 hurricane season. Now, what could be a much more significant player in the medium and extended range is this tropical wave that is now being highlighted by the Hurricane Center Outlook. It only has a 10% chance of development within the next 48 hours, but those chances go way up as we go into the medium range. And all of the models suggest that this will be a threat to the Northeast Caribbean and possibly the Bahamas and Southeast United States down the road. The regional satellite shows both systems in question quite well. This is 93L Invest located to the south of Jamaica, and we are beginning to see a convective flare-up overnight here with diurnal minimum. And we also have this tropical wave. This is going to be the big one, and it's really not going to develop too fast immediately, but wait for things to change in a few days. It has been several hours since we've had a microwave satellite pass, and we also don't have visible imagery quite yet since it's so early in the morning, but we can see on the shortwave infrared that 93L Invest does appear to be developing a low-level circulation that may already be at the surface. We can see that convection is developing in the mid-levels, but notice these low-level banding features below the convective cloud tops, and that is a strong indication that the system may already be making its way toward tropical depression status, and that's thanks to this recent blow-up of convection. And once again, the upper level pattern still looks fairly conducive for at least slow development into a marginal tropical cyclone before this makes landfall within about 48 hours. We are now looking at the low-level steering flow, and we talked about this in yesterday afternoon's video. We see that some of these lines would denote that there is some west-southwest motion that should soon commence, but the analysis map is also taking into account the actual presence of the tropical wave axis, so this isn't the true steering flow, and in fact you need to look a little bit more toward the north to really get a good feel as to what may occur. We have a low to mid-level ridge dominating much of the southwest Atlantic, and we have a second area of ridging over much of the northwest Gulf of Mexico, and in between two of these features we do have a slight weakness in the middle, and that could induce a little bit more of a poleward motion versus this thing moving due west, which would have taken this directly into Honduras. And I think the more likely scenario is that this only scrapes the Honduran coastline. It does make it into the Gulf of Honduras, giving it a couple more hours over the open waters to intensify before making a final landfall in the extreme lower half of the Belize coastline. You may also remember from yesterday afternoon's video that several of these tropical models were beginning to show a west-southwest track, and now they're beginning to see that the low-level center is still continuing to move just north of due west, and now the models are beginning to shift back toward the north just ever so gradually, and much of them now take this back into the Gulf of Honduras like they were about 36 hours ago. So once again, I still think that this is going to make a final landfall in southern Belize. Now that doesn't mean that Honduras is completely off the hook. I still think that you guys, especially along the northern half of the country, do have a risk of experiencing some heavy rainfall over a 1 to 2 day span. So everyone from Honduras northward into Belize and the lower half of the Yucatan Peninsula needs to be on the lookout, especially for the risk of flooding. I really don't think the wind risk is going to be overly significant, and I don't expect that this will make a run at hurricane status. So primary threats will be heavy rainfall and flooding. Before we discuss the Central Atlantic tropical wave, I should also mention that we do not expect any type of regeneration from 93L Invest. It should remain mostly to the south of the Gulf of Mexico due to the presence of strong mid-level ridging to the north. So if we switch gears here to our Central Atlantic tropical wave, it is still not an Invest, and that is somewhat surprising, but I'm certainly thinking that the Hurricane Center is not expecting development to be overly imminent within the next 48 hours, so they're holding off on making this the next Invest. And as we can see on the latest satellite imagery, the broad cyclonic circulation envelope is fairly large, which is an indication that we have a lot of mid to upper level ridging across quite a large area here, and it's now beginning to work its way toward 40 degrees west longitude. If we turn on the enhanced infrared, we see that convection is still lacking, which is really not much of a surprise. We didn't expect this dry air to go anywhere anytime soon. We can still see that dry air working in from the north and west, and that's all that Saharan air being blown in from the northeast due to the trade winds. And really none of the models show much in the way of development over the next 3 to 4 days. It's not until this system gets closer to the Northeast Caribbean, or actually even in the Northeast Caribbean, until the models really begin to show some robust tropical development. The latest low-level vorticity analysis is just another indicator that we have a well-defined low-level circulation. The system simply just needs more moisture and convection to work with in order to begin to really develop. But the system does have help on the way. We are looking at the latest sea surface temperatures across the basin. Our tropical disturbance is located right around here, and certainly as this moves more toward the west, it's going to be running into warmer sea surface temperatures, which is going to allow this to develop more thunderstorm activity and fight off some of that dry air. And we can also see on the shear analysis that that favorable upper level ridge is located directly where our tropical wave is located. All of these blue colors indicate areas with less than 10 knots of vertical wind shear, and we can see it on this chart as well. Here's the western extent of that upper level ridge beginning to move into the picture, and notice that we still have that upper level low to the northeast of Puerto Rico. This would shear this system apart if it just kept on moving in without the help of that upper level ridge, but all of the models forecast that upper level low to move toward the north, so we should have a fairly favorable pattern across much of the region within the next 5 to 7 days. If we go back to the low-level steering pattern for just a moment, if all things were to remain the same, then this tropical wave would be moving due west for at least the next week or so, but the models are temporarily weakening the ridge over much of the central and western Atlantic, and there is some model disagreement once we get closer to the Caribbean. Some of the models take this into the Lesser Antilles closer to Martinique and Dominica, whereas we have the northernmost model being the European model that takes this more toward the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. Starting with the 0Z Canadian CMC forecast, we see that the tropical wave is fairly weak initially, and it doesn't show much in the way of development until we get into the Eastern Caribbean. And as of early this morning, the CMC is one of the furthest west models by taking this just to the south of Hispaniola by day 6. And the general timetable for this crossing through the Lesser Antilles is during the daytime hours on Sunday as potentially a tropical depression or a weak tropical storm, but once again, much of that intensification is expected to come afterward based on this model. We are now looking at the latest 0Z GFS, and this model solution is just a hair north of the CMC by taking this a little bit closer to Puerto Rico, and it has it skimming the northeast coast of the Dominican Republic, and then here we are by day 7 with a developing hurricane to the north of eastern Cuba over the southern Bahamas. Now we're going to switch over to the 0Z ECMWF. This is the developing tropical wave. This is the Lesser Antilles, Puerto Rico, Florida is way over here, and notice how over day 1, day 2, and day 3 we don't really see much in the way of significant development, but notice that the model is a bit more toward the north in track compared to the GFS and CMC. By day 4, notice that instead of taking this into the extreme northeast Caribbean, it takes it a little bit more toward the north into the Virgin Islands. And as we get into day 5, we notice that the storm has taken a bit more of a westerly turn, putting this directly over Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. And once again, if this gets overly close to Hispaniola, that could disrupt the storm's intensity, and also this could make the track forecast a bit more difficult to solve. So there are quite a lot of question marks once we get beyond day 5. But overall, within the first 4 to 5 days of the forecast, it looks pretty straightforward. We can expect a tropical storm to be impacting the northeast Caribbean islands, and then after that, we'll just have to wait and see. But since we've already looked at the GFS and CMC through day 4, day 5, and day 6, I'm going to go ahead and start to show you what they're showing beyond that point. Now keep in mind, this is a really difficult and extended forecast, but here we are, day 6. We have a developing tropical storm, more than likely a hurricane in the southeast Bahamas, much like the GFS was indicating. And by day 7 and day 8, we see continued intensification. This is now a rather significant hurricane located just to the east of the Florida Peninsula. And if you were to fully believe in the European model, we go out to day 9, we see continued development. This is basically a major hurricane for dynamical model standards. And by day 10, we have a major hurricane striking the Carolina coastline. Simply put, if this does develop as expected, And if it manages to avoid Hispaniola, or at least the heart of Hispaniola, which is a big wild card at the moment, but if it does that, then this could be one of the biggest threats to the southeast United States since Hurricane Ike in 2008. So what are some of the big things that we will be looking for pattern-wise? Well, starting off with the 72-hour forecast from the European model, our tropical system is expected to be bearing down on the northeast Caribbean. It's being guided toward the west-northwest to the south of this powerful mid-level ridge over much of the Atlantic. Notice how there really isn't much of a trough over the western Atlantic, but as we go into day 4, we definitely see a lot of deepening trough action over the east coast United States. By day 5, that trough deepens even more, and therefore it's setting up a weakness over much of the southwest Atlantic, and that could be enough to draw this storm just to the north of Hispaniola. If that were to verify, then we more than likely will have significant problems, because that means this storm will not really have much to keep it down, and it will likely continue to intensify into a hurricane as it aims for the southeast Bahamas. And the problem is that this trough does not stay. By day 6, we already see that the trough is beginning to lift out. By day 7, that trough is now fully gone, and we see that much of the mid-level ridging over the Atlantic is now expanding westward into much of the U.S. East Coast, and that's simply going to act to draw this storm straight toward the southeast United States. By, once again, day 8, day 9, and day 10, we see that landfall straight into the East Coast. Now, I've already shown you the CMC, but just to refresh your memory, this is the 6-day sea level pressure forecast. Once again, not much development, and it takes it a bit more toward the south and west versus what the European is. But by day 6, it's sitting just to the south of Haiti. And we just changed sources really quickly, but we're still looking at the CMC forecast. Again, this is day 6. This is Hispaniola. This is the storm. This is Cuba. Here's Florida. This is the same long wave trough that the European is showing. But look at what the problem is. Once again, by day 7, that trough is lifting toward the north. The central Atlantic ridge is building back toward the west. This is the western extent of it here, just to the east of the Bahamas. And by day 8, notice that the CMC takes it as far west as central Cuba, but it's still a powerful hurricane moving a little bit closer to Florida. And then by day 9, it's paralleling the eastern Florida coast here, and then by day 10, much like the European, it's showing a more northerly movement closer to the Carolinas. And we also talked about the short-term GFS, but now we're going to start off with the mid-level pattern forecast starting at day 5. Here is the tropical cyclone over the Dominican Republic. There is the initial long wave trough that should be strong enough to at least pull this into the southwest Atlantic and Bahamas. And as we go into day 6, we see that the trough begins to start lifting out here, and then by day 7 we really see a lot of sign or indication that that central Atlantic ridge is building back toward the west, and then it's now making its way fully into the eastern United States, which eventually just pushes this hurricane straight into the Florida Peninsula. Now, before anyone gets overly concerned or excited, I want to just reiterate once again that the major wild card with this is going to be how much land interaction this storm has with Hispaniola, as this could greatly disrupt whatever is expected to happen beyond day 5. Now, what does give me a little bit added confidence, though, is that we definitely have a fair amount of model agreement considering it's 7 days away. And also when we look at some of the GFS and European ensembles, we see that there is a hefty amount of agreement even between the ensemble members. So if we look starting off at day 5 with the GFS ensemble mean, we see that there is the original trough. Here is where the overall position of the storm is expected to be, and when we switch over to the European for the same time, we notice that there's really not that much in the way of any differences. The trough is in the same general position along with our tropical cyclone. If we fast forward to about 168 hours, or day 7, this is the latest GFS forecast. Notice that the main trough has lifted toward the north back into Canada. It has split off a slight piece of energy over the central Gulf Coast, and that little piece of energy coming down is still the main reason why the models show a turn more toward the north once it gets close to or directly over Florida. And if we switch over to the European ensemble average, again, we have very similar agreement here. The trough is now gone. We just have this leftover split off piece here over the central Gulf Coast, which should eventually turn the system a bit more toward the north if you fully believe in what the models are currently advertising. And really quickly in the eastern Pacific, we still have Tropical Storm Fernanda and now Hurricane Greg, but neither one of these systems are any threat to land. So just to recap all of today's highlights, we do expect that we will have a tropical depression or tropical storm form very close to Honduras and Belize right before landfall. The main threats will be heavy rain and some isolated flooding. And then finally, as we get into the 3 to 4 day range, we will more than likely see yet another tropical cyclone formation over the Caribbean islands. And then this system could become a significant hurricane threat to the Bahamas and possibly the southeast United States, as long as it doesn't fall apart significantly over much of Hispaniola. So this is just a wait and see game at this point, but the writing is on the wall for at least a significant threat down the road if all remains the same. So thanks again for visiting 28storms.com. We'll stay up to date on this as much as we possibly can, so come back soon for more information.